Hello, my friend. I got a question for you. Here it is. Have you ever read something like a textbook or a novel, and you read the page and you go, what did I just read? Okay, I'll read it over again. And you read it again and you go, I still have no idea what I just read. Come on, be honest. There was some class, for me it was geology. I would get this textbook open and I'm telling you, it was better than Sominex. I'm reading this textbook and I would go, what in the world did you just say? And the next thing I know, I'd wake up with my face pressed into page 52, a little bit of drool. It just didn't click with me. Okay, let's be honest. Sometimes the Old Testament in the Bible can be that way for us. We get into the Numbers book or the prophets and it seems repetitive and we're like, what is this? Even some people have kind of advocated for going, well, let's just make the New Testament the big deal and we'll forget about or kind of disassociate with all of the Old Testament. I think this is a big mistake. First of all, it's a big mistake because Jesus loved the Old Testament. In fact, one of the things that Jesus got accused of right from the beginning of his ministry was he goes to parties and he's trying to change the Old Testament. That is actually the original criticism of Jesus. Look at this. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, he answers the criticism. Jesus says, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." That is so interesting. Okay. The law, that's the first 5 books of the Bible, and the prophets, that's the rest of the Old Testament. So Jesus is saying, listen, I'm not changing a dot or tittle, the smallest little letters in the alphabet. I'm not changing a dot or tittle of this whole thing called the Old Testament. A couple just thoughts to meditate on. First of all, Jesus is an Old Testament super fan. Don't let anyone tell you Jesus never preached against this sin and Jesus never stood up against this sin. Jesus accepts all of the moral standards of the Old Testament. He doesn't lessen them and he doesn't lighten them. He supports them. But the second point is equally true. Jesus is the only one who purely and correctly lives out and interprets the Old Testament. Jesus said a lot, verily, verily, that old King James phrase. What does that mean? Truly, truly. What he's saying is, I'm about to tell you how to look at this truth. Or he says, you have heard it said, but now I tell you. What he's saying there is you've been taught wrong. I'm going to reinterpret the Old Testament. So when we actually go to this confusing section of scriptures, these assembly of ancient books that are written in a Bronze Age and even Stone Age mindset by tribal people that are constantly at war in an entirely different culture, and for most of us, a different continent, how should we interpret them? Well, we should do it by listening to what Jesus has to say about the Old Testament. This brings up my second point. First of all, Jesus loved the Old Testament. Second of all, the Old Testament is great for you. Okay, here's where you start, so it's not confusing and you can really connect to it. You start with a book called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. Got a picture of it right here, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, by Fee and Stewart. There's at least 4 chapters in this that are dedicated to the genres of the Old Testament. And once you kind of orientate yourself to what genre it is, what the author's going after, how the Holy Spirit inspired him, it's going to start coming alive. And here's some good news for you. You're going to realize that not all of the Old Testament is supposed to be in your daily devotion times first thing in the morning. Some of it is not for that at all, like the book of Numbers, parts of it. So here's the big principle. The Bible was written for you, but it wasn't written to you. So some of the things in the Old Testament, we learn from them by understanding how they benefited other generations and other places. Then we apply it to our life. Okay, I'm getting too deep here. It's just the refuel in the morning. I want to tell you, make a commitment to get into the Old Testament. Make a commitment to learn about what Jesus meant that he's fulfilling the Old Testament. How do you do that? You come to church and you listen to the teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. And you yourself make a commitment to saying, I'm going to understand God's story from Genesis to Revelation.